On November 25, 1941, HMS Barham is operating in the eastern Mediterranean as part of Force A, moving at approximately 16 knots on a steady course, constrained by formation geometry and fuel economy rather than tactical urgency. The battleship displaces over 31,000 tons, carries a layered armor scheme designed to absorb distributed damage, and relies on compartmentalization to convert penetration into time. That reliance is structural. It assumes minutes. The surrounding system assumes the same. Escort spacing is optimized for surface and air threats, not for a submerged attacker already inside the screen. Detection probability is treated as cumulative rather than binary. No single contact is decisive. This assumption is the first constraint. It limits reaction planning to average timelines rather than worst-case compression. U-331, a Type VIC submarine, operates under an entirely different constraint set. Battery endurance, submerged speed, and periscope exposure impose a narrow execution window. At periscope depth, speed is limited to approximately 6 knots without rapid battery depletion. Detection risk rises exponentially with exposure time. The submarine cannot afford delay. Its attack profile must fit inside seconds, not minutes. At the moment of contact, distance collapses into time. Barham's silhouette fills the periscope field. Range is reduced to under 400 meters. At this distance, torpedo runtime drops below 30 seconds. That figure is critical. It is shorter than the combined delay imposed by detection, classification, command acknowledgement, helm response, and hydrodynamic inertia of a battleship at cruising speed. This is the governing physical constraint. Response time exceeds execution time. Once this inequality exists, all other variables become secondary. Armor thickness no longer functions as a buffer because it is not engaged gradually. Compartmentalization no longer buys time because damage is asymmetrical. Flooding rate exceeds pump capacity almost immediately. List increases past recovery thresholds before corrective ballast transfer can be completed. The torpedoes strike in rapid succession. The first detonation compromises internal structure. The second accelerates flooding. The third intersects stored cordite. The interval between initial impact and catastrophic magazine explosion is measured in seconds, not minutes. There is no temporal space for corrective action. Damage control doctrine is present, trained, and irrelevant. This outcome is not the result of poor execution aboard Barham. It is the result of a system operating inside a configuration where recovery time does not exist. The battleship's design assumes staggered damage. The engagement delivers simultaneous asymmetry. The design assumption fails instantly. At the operational level, this reveals a deeper constraint. Capital ships depend on time-intensive survivability mechanisms. They convert mass into delay. When delay is unavailable, mass becomes inertia rather than protection. The larger the system, the longer its minimum response cycle. That cycle cannot be compressed below physical limits imposed by hydrodynamics and human reaction. Submarines exploit this asymmetry by design. Their offensive power is not derived from sustained fire, but from the ability to deliver effect faster than the defender can adapt. That power peaks only when geometry, speed, and detection align to compress timelines. U-331 does not defeat Barham's armor. It bypasses Barham's clock. The surrounding doctrine fails because it does not model this bypass explicitly. Escort patterns assume detection will occur early enough to force the attacker to expend time approaching. In this case, approach is already complete. The system reacts to a state that no longer exists. Once the timeline collapses, control collapses with it. Command authority persists formally, but it has no operational meaning. Orders issued after the second detonation cannot influence outcome. The engagement is already decided. This is the immediate crisis, not the explosion, but the loss of temporal margin that makes the explosion unavoidable. From this point, pressure propagates outward through doctrine. If a single submarine can convert proximity into irreversible effect inside one response cycle, then any configuration allowing the proximity is invalid. The conclusion is mechanical. It does not depend on intent, courage, or error. Operational planning begins to shift accordingly. Safe distance is redefined not by weapon range, but by weapon range minus response latency. Formation speed is reconsidered because higher speed reduces turning radius margin but increases hydrodynamic inertia. Escort density is recalculated to ensure overlapping detection arcs before terminal approach distances are reached. Each adjustment targets seconds. The Barham sinking demonstrates that survivability is not binary. It is temporal. A system survives if it can delay failure long enough to act. When failure accelerates faster than action, survival probability drops to zero regardless of strength. This recognition introduces a new organizing principle. Naval warfare becomes less about absorbing damage and more about preventing timelines from collapsing. Prevention operates upstream. It denies configurations where execution can outrun response. As this principle spreads, catastrophic single-event losses become rarer. Not because threats diminish, but because systems refuse to enter states where such losses are possible. The absence of drama is the product of constraint, not complacency. Barham occupies a precise position in this transition. It occurs before the constraint is fully internalized, when doctrine still tolerates narrow margins. Its analytical value lies in how completely it demonstrates the cost of that tolerance. The ship sinks in minutes. The system that allowed it to sink is dismantled over years, replaced by one that treats time as the primary resource and collapse as an unacceptable mode of failure. The logic continues to unfold from that point, shaping how fleets move, how authority is distributed, and how risk is defined long after the wreck has settled and the immediate event has passed. From that dismantling emerges a second, less visible transformation. Doctrine no longer asks whether a threat can be defeated after it appears. It asks whether the system allows the threat to appear at all. This inversion is structural. It shifts emphasis from reaction to exclusion, from engagement to geometry. After November 1941, capital ship employment in confined or semi-confined waters is re-evaluated against explicit time budgets. Detection range is translated into seconds at approach speed. Command latency is measured, not assumed. If the sum of sensor delay, reporting delay, decision delay, and helm response exceeds the attacker's time to effect inside a given radius, that radius becomes forbidden space. The rule is absolute, is not advisory. HMS Barham demonstrates why. At 16 knots, with a turning circle measured in hundreds of meters and a rudder response time counted in seconds, the ship cannot generate meaningful evasive displacement once a torpedo is launched from under 400 meters. Even a full overhelm order cannot translate into lateral movement fast enough to defeat a short-run salvo. The physics close the window before doctrine can intervene. This realization reframes escort function. Escorts are no longer judged by how effectively they engage submarines after detection, but by whether they prevent submarines from entering the terminal geometry in the first place. An escort that never fires a weapon but maintains a detection barrier that forces early evasion is considered successful. Engagement becomes evidence of prior failure, not of initiative. The constraint also alters speed doctrine. Higher speed reduces transit time, but increases hydrodynamic inertia and acoustic signature. Lower speed improves maneuverability and detection fidelity, but lengthens exposure. The Barham case reveals that neither extreme is safe if the chosen speed compresses response time below execution time. Optimal speed becomes a function of time margin, not a schedule. At the tactical level, this produces a subtle but decisive change. Commanders become less willing to accept acceptable risk when that risk threatens temporal collapse. Risks that degrade capability gradually are tolerated. Risks that can eliminate all future options in under one response cycle are rejected outright. This distinction is new. It emerges directly from events like Barham. For submarine forces, the same logic applies inversely. Attacks that promise decisive effect only if execution consumes all remaining margin are recognized as self-terminating. U-331 survives Barham largely by circumstance. Subsequent doctrine cannot rely on such fortune. As defenses thicken, attacks requiring near-zero margin become strategically inefficient. Submarines increasingly trade spectacle for persistence. This mutual adaptation reshapes the battle space. Encounters stretch in time. Pressure replaces shock. The war at sea becomes a contest of exclusion zones rather than of singular collisions. Barham remains exceptional because it occurs at the moment when exclusion has not yet become the dominant organizing principle. The technical lesson embedded here is precise. Complex systems fail catastrophically when multiple tolerable delays align within a single interval shorter than the system's minimum corrective cycle. Barham is a textbook case of such alignment. No single delay is decisive. Their concurrence is. Once recognized, concurrence becomes the primary threat to be managed. Systems are redesigned to desynchronize vulnerabilities. Sensor outages are staggered. Patrol rotations overlap. Command authority is distributed to prevent relay bottlenecks. Each measure reduces the probability that all delays peak simultaneously. This desynchronization is not dramatic. It produces no visible victories. Its success is measured by the absence of collapse. That absence, however, defines the latter half of the war at sea. In this sense, HMS Barham is not a relic of obsolete warfare. It is an early demonstration of a modern failure mode. Its relevance persists because the underlying variables, distance, speed, detection, and human reaction, remain fundamental. Technology shifts their values. It does not abolish their relationships. The engagement therefore functions as a calibration point. Whenever planners confront a new configuration, new weapons, new sensors, new environments, they implicitly test it against the Barham condition. Does this configuration allow an attacker to compress execution below response? If yes, the configuration is rejected or modified. If no, it is considered viable. This logic extends beyond naval warfare. Air defense, missile defense, and later automated systems all confront the same inequality. Once execution outruns response, control ceases within that interaction. The only remedy is prevention upstream. Barham's significance lies in how cleanly it demonstrates this truth. There is no ambiguity in cause. There is no opportunity for recovery. The ship's fate is sealed not by enemy intent, but by arithmetic. And because arithmetic does not change with sentiment, the lesson persists. The system learns not to trust strength alone, not to assume time will be available, and not to tolerate configurations where margin can vanish in seconds. Where that learning is applied, catastrophe becomes rare. Where it is ignored, collapse remains as swift and absolute as it was in the Eastern Mediterranean in 1941. From that arithmetic emerges a third-order constraint that reshapes how uncertainty itself is handled. Uncertainty is no longer treated as noise to be reduced. It is treated as a load that consumes time. Every unknown forces verification. Every verification consumes seconds. When available seconds are few, uncertainty becomes lethal even before any weapon is fired. HMS Barham operates inside such a regime. The fleet does not know precisely where U-331 is. That uncertainty is tolerated because doctrine assumes that confirmation will arrive before execution. In reality, confirmation arrives after execution has already begun. The uncertainty does not cause the loss directly. It delays recognition just long enough for the remaining margin to disappear. Post-1941 doctrine responds by redefining acceptable uncertainty. Situations that cannot be resolved quickly enough are avoided altogether. Ambiguous contacts are treated conservatively. Routes through areas with poor acoustic conditions are reclassified as high risk regardless of enemy presence. The system prefers false positives to delayed certainty because false positives consume time gradually, while delayed certainty consumes it all at once. This preference alters sensor integration. Partial detections gain value. A faint contact that extends warning by 15 seconds is operationally more valuable than a precise classification that arrives too late. Systems are optimized to trigger early action rather than perfect understanding. This is a direct inversion of earlier doctrine, which prized confirmation before maneuver. Barham demonstrates why that inversion is necessary. By the time classification is complete, classification no longer matters. The decisive interval has already passed. Action must therefore precede certainty. The system must be willing to maneuver, reposition, or withdraw based on incomplete information if doing so preserves margin. This shift has measurable consequences. Evasive maneuvers become more frequent. Formations appear less tidy. Fuel consumption increases. Operational tempo slows. Yet survivability improves because timelines remain open. The Barham case shows the cost of preserving order at the expense of time. Order delays reaction. Delay kills. At the engineering level, this logic drives the integration of automation. Automation is not introduced to remove humans, but to remove latency. Tasks that add even a few seconds of delay are delegated to machines if they can be executed faster. Alarms are simplified. Decision trees are flattened. The objective is not better decisions, but earlier ones. However, automation introduces its own constraint. Automated systems operate on predefined thresholds. If thresholds are set incorrectly, they can trigger unnecessary maneuvers that consume time elsewhere. The system therefore balances automation against predictability. Barham sits at the point where automation is absent and human latency dominates. Later systems struggle to ensure that automation reduces total latency rather than redistributing it. This struggle reinforces the central lesson. There is no single solution to temporal collapse. Margins must be preserved across multiple layers simultaneously. Sensors, command, maneuver, and damage control must all operate within compatible time budgets. If any layer falls behind, the entire system inherits that delay. The Barham sinking illustrates what happens when compatibility is assumed rather than enforced. Each layer functions within its own expectations. No layer fails individually. Together, they fail collectively because their timelines do not align. Once this is understood, alignment becomes the central design problem. Systems are evaluated not for peak performance, but for coherence under worst-case timing. Exercises are structured to stress alignment deliberately. Failures are analyzed by tracing seconds, not by assigning blame. Over time, this produces a professional culture that is intolerant of hidden delay. Processes that cannot be executed quickly enough are either accelerated or removed. Authority structures are simplified. Communication paths are shortened. Each reform targets the same objective: keep execution slower than response. The Barham engagement thus continues to shape behavior not by memory, but by architecture. Its specifics fade, but its constraint remains active wherever systems operate under time pressure. The ship's destruction becomes less important than the inequality it exposes. As technology advances, that inequality becomes harder to manage. Weapons accelerate. Sensors proliferate. Information volume increases. Each advancement threatens to compress timelines further. The risk of sudden collapse grows unless margins are expanded deliberately. This is why the logic does not conclude. It propagates forward, adapting to new contexts while preserving its core relationship. Wherever forces interact at speed, the Barham condition lurks as a possibility. It is not dramatic. It is not announced. It simply exists, waiting to be either respected or violated. The monolith continues because the problem it addresses does not resolve. Time remains finite. Reaction remains slower than execution in some configurations. Control remains conditional. The only choice available to any system is whether it acknowledges that condition early enough to act, or whether it discovers it only after the last available seconds are already gone. The next layer exposes how margin preservation reshapes not only movement and detection, but the internal rhythm of command itself. Once time is recognized as the decisive resource, command cycles are redesigned to fit inside fixed temporal envelopes rather than expanding organically. Orders are no longer crafted for optimal clarity. They are crafted for minimal execution delay. Ambiguity is accepted if it saves seconds. Precision is sacrificed if it costs them. HMS Barham operates under an older rhythm. Reports flow upward. Decisions flow downward. Each relay adds latency measured in seconds. Under normal conditions, this rhythm is adequate. Under compressed engagement, it becomes fatal. The submarine's execution chain bypasses the rhythm entirely. The battleship's command structure cannot accelerate past its own design limits. Post-1941 adjustments target this mismatch directly. Standing orders replace situational directives. Command intent is pre-authorized within narrow bands. Helm and engineering are empowered to act without waiting for confirmation when defined thresholds are crossed. These thresholds are numerical: a contact closing rate above a set value, a detection range below a set distance, a time to effect estimate under a fixed number of seconds. When thresholds trigger, action is automatic. This automation of authority is not a philosophical choice. It is a response to physics. Human deliberation consumes time that no longer exists once execution accelerates. Barham demonstrates that deliberation after contact is irrelevant when contact occurs inside the terminal zone. Authority must therefore be exercised earlier, before certainty, or not at all. This shift also alters how responsibility is distributed. Responsibility moves from individual judgment at the moment of crisis to system design beforehand. If a loss occurs, analysis focuses on why the system allowed timelines to collapse, not on how individuals reacted within the collapse. The event is treated as a design failure rather than an execution failure. The Barham sinking fits this interpretation precisely. No action taken aboard the ship after torpedo impact could have altered the outcome. Analysis, therefore, moves upstream. Why was the ship operating at that speed? Why was escort spacing configured as it was? Why was air coverage absent at that hour? Each question targets seconds lost long before the first explosion. As this analytical posture hardens, planning becomes increasingly intolerant of configurations that rely on favorable reaction. Favorable reaction is treated as a contingency, not a foundation. Systems are expected to survive worst-case timing without requiring exceptional performance. Exceptional performance is unreliable under stress. Barham confirms this brutally. At the same time, the attacker's calculus changes. As defenders compress their own timelines and extend detection outward, the attacker's opportunity to bypass response narrows. Attacks that once fit comfortably inside the defender's delay now require extreme proximity or exceptional luck. The risk of counter-detection rises sharply. The cost of failure increases. Attack frequency declines. This decline does not indicate weakness. It indicates stabilization. Both sides operate closer to the limits of controllability without crossing them. The battle space becomes dense with caution. Movement slow. Contacts are probed rather than exploited. The absence of decisive events is the direct consequence of systems designed to prevent decisive events from forming. The Barham engagement remains analytically distinct because it occurs before this stabilization is complete. It is a pure case of temporal bypass. There is no gradual erosion. There is no drawn-out battle. There is only alignment, execution, and collapse. That purity makes it valuable as a reference point. Later losses are messy. They involve partial failures, layered responses, and prolonged engagements. Barham stands apart because it shows what happens when layers are absent or misaligned. It defines the lower bound of survivability. As doctrine absorbs this bound, it becomes increasingly conservative about allowing forces to approach it. Margins are padded. Buffers are added. Redundancy is distributed across time rather than across mass. Each change is incremental. Together, they move the system away from the boundary. Yet the boundary never disappears. It moves with technology. Faster weapons reduce execution time. Improved sensors extend warning time. Automation shortens response cycles. Each advancement shifts the line. The risk remains that execution will again outrun response if assumptions lag behind reality. The enduring relevance of HMS Barham lies in this dynamic. It shows that assumptions about time must be continuously revalidated. What was safe yesterday may be terminal tomorrow if speeds increase or latencies accumulate. The system must therefore remain adaptive, not complacent. The monolith continues to build, because this adaptation is never complete. Each layer reinforces the same relationship under new conditions. Time remains finite. Reaction remains bounded. Control remains conditional. Wherever those conditions intersect, the possibility of sudden collapse persists. Barham is not unique because it happened once. It is unique because it happened cleanly enough to reveal the structure beneath the chaos. That structure continues to govern every engagement that follows, whether it produces catastrophe or, more often, prevents it by shaping choices long before the first contact is made. As this logic matures, it begins to influence not only how forces act, but how success itself is defined and recorded. Metrics shift away from visible outcomes toward invisible preservation. A patrol that completes its cycle without entering a terminal timing envelope is logged as effective, even if no enemy is engaged. A convoy that alters course repeatedly in response to ambiguous contacts is considered resilient, not indecisive. The system rewards time preserved rather than damage inflicted. HMS Barham stands in sharp contrast to this later accounting. Its loss is total, immediate, and unmistakable. There is no ambiguity in the result. That clarity is precisely what drives the change. The event leaves no space for reinterpretation. It demonstrates that certain configurations convert uncertainty into certainty in the worst possible direction. From this point onward, operational reports increasingly track time-related variables explicitly. Time to detection, time to classification, time to first evasive action, time to recovery. These intervals are measured during exercises and compared against theoretical attacker execution chains. If any measured interval exceeds acceptable bounds, corrective action is mandated. The process is iterative and unforgiving. This emphasis alters training priorities. Crews are drilled not only to perform actions correctly, but to perform them within fixed temporal limits. Delays are recorded. Seconds are counted. A maneuver executed flawlessly but too late is treated as failure. The Barham case justifies this harsh standard. In a compressed engagement, correctness without speed is indistinguishable from inaction. The same discipline reshapes maintenance and readiness. Equipment that introduces unpredictable delay is removed from critical pathways. Redundant systems are tested not for functionality alone, but for switchover time. A backup that takes 20 seconds to activate may be worse than no backup at all if those 20 seconds consume the last available margin. At the strategic level, these accumulated practices contribute to a broader stabilization of naval warfare. Decisive engagements become rare not because fleets are weaker, but because systems are less permissive. Power is exercised through sustained presence, denial of access, and gradual attrition rather than through sudden annihilation. The battleship, once a symbol of decisive power, becomes increasingly constrained by the very systems designed to protect it. Barham's sinking, therefore, acquires a paradoxical legacy. It accelerates the decline of the type of engagement that destroys it. By revealing the vulnerability of concentrated mass to temporal bypass, it pushes doctrine toward dispersion, layering, and standoff. The result is a battle space where mass still matters, but only when buffered by time. This buffering becomes more elaborate as the war progresses. Air patrols extend detection outward by minutes. Radar adds seconds where none existed before. Intelligence reduces uncertainty days in advance. Each addition increases the depth of the timeline. None eliminates the boundary entirely. They merely push it outward, buying more room in which to act. The Barham engagement remains useful precisely because it represents the boundary in its most compressed form. It shows the system at the moment when the buffer is effectively zero. That moment provides a reference against which all later improvements can be measured. How many seconds have been added? How many layers now exist? How much margin has been restored? As warfare continues to evolve beyond 1945, this mode of thinking persists. Missiles reduce execution times to fractions of a minute. Automated systems respond in milliseconds. Human decision-making is increasingly displaced upstream. Yet the fundamental problem remains unchanged. Control exists only if response precedes effect. Once effect precedes response, control is lost within that interaction. In this sense, HMS Barham is not an artifact of a bygone era. It is an early data point in a continuing pattern. Each technological shift risks recreating similar conditions unless doctrine adapts in time. The cost of failing to adapt is always the same: sudden, irreversible loss. The monolithic analysis, therefore, does not seek closure in narrative terms. It seeks permanence in structural terms. The Barham sinking becomes less a story about a ship and more a constraint embedded in how modern military systems think about time, risk, and control. As long as those systems continue to operate under pressure, the logic derived from that morning in November 1941 remains active. It governs decisions silently, shaping what is attempted and what is avoided. Where it is respected, catastrophe is prevented without fanfare. Where it is ignored, collapse arrives without warning, just as it did when HMS Barham's remaining margin vanished in a matter of seconds. At this stage, the constraint penetrates even deeper, reaching the level at which assumptions about human cognition itself are incorporated into operational design. Reaction time is no longer treated as a variable that can be improved indefinitely through training. It is treated as a fixed biological limit. Doctrine accepts that under stress, perception narrows, decision latency increases, and error probability rises. These effects are not moral failures. They are physiological constants. HMS Barham's loss illustrates the consequence of ignoring those constants. Even if detection had occurred moments earlier, the remaining interval would still have been insufficient for coordinated response. The human element would have been forced to operate at the edge of its capacity, where hesitation and delay are unavoidable. The system demanded performance that biology could not deliver. Collapse followed. Post-1941 design philosophy therefore shifts toward accommodating human limits rather than attempting to overcome them. Interfaces are simplified. Signals are standardized. Decision trees are reduced to binary triggers. The aim is to ensure that when time is scarce, the system does not require complex interpretation. Complexity consumes seconds. Simplicity preserves them. This adjustment has cascading effects. Training emphasizes recognition over analysis. Crews are conditioned to act on patterns rather than to diagnose situations fully. This is not anti-intellectual. It is temporal optimization. In a compressed engagement, pattern recognition is the only cognitive mode fast enough to matter. Barham demonstrates what happens when recognition arrives too late to be useful. The same principle reshapes how warnings are framed. Alarms are designed to demand immediate action rather than to inform. Informational richness is sacrificed in favor of urgency. A single tone that triggers evasive maneuver is valued more than a detailed report that arrives after the execution window has closed. The system privileges action over understanding when margin is thin. From the attacker's perspective, this cognitive constraint is equally decisive. Submarine commanders must execute attack sequences under extreme time pressure. Once committed, reversal options are limited. The Barham attack succeeds because execution is rehearsed to the point of automaticity. There is no deliberation at the moment of launch. Any hesitation would have consumed the narrow margin available. As defenses adapt, this margin shrinks further. Attacks that once allowed seconds for decision now allow fractions. The cognitive burden increases. Errors multiply. The cost of a single misjudgment becomes terminal. This dynamic further reduces the frequency of attacks that rely on compressed timelines. Persistence and denial again replace shock. At the system level, the interaction of human limits and mechanical limits reinforces the same conclusion. No amount of bravery or expertise can compensate for a configuration that demands reaction faster than humans can respond. Systems that require such reaction are misdesigned. Barham's loss is therefore interpreted not as a failure of personnel, but as evidence of a flawed temporal architecture. This interpretation influences accountability culture. Investigations focus on upstream design choices rather than on downstream behavior. The question becomes whether the system placed individuals in an impossible situation. If it did, responsibility lies with design, not with execution. This stance marks a profound shift from earlier eras of warfare, where individual failure was often emphasized. The Barham sinking contributes to this shift by providing an unmistakable case of impossibility. Once the terminal geometry is reached, no human action aboard the ship can prevent the outcome. The system has already failed. Recognizing this frees doctrine to pursue prevention without moralizing reaction. As layers of prevention accumulate, the system becomes increasingly intolerant of configurations that flirt with human limits. Margins are padded to account for stress-induced delay. Worst-case reaction times, not ideal ones, are used in planning. The gap between execution and response is deliberately widened beyond theoretical minimums. Yet the fundamental tension remains. Technology accelerates execution faster than it accelerates cognition. Each generation of weapons reduces available reaction time. Each generation of doctrine must therefore compensate by acting earlier, farther upstream. The problem never resolves. It only shifts location. HMS Barham remains relevant because it captures the moment when this tension becomes undeniable. It is a case where the demand placed on the system exceeds both mechanical and human limits simultaneously. The collapse is total because no layer can compensate for another. This recognition feeds into the final, enduring principle of modern warfare. Design must assume failure and preserve time for recovery. Systems that assume flawless performance under compression are brittle. Systems that assume delay and error remain resilient. Barham demonstrates the cost of brittleness with brutal clarity. The monolith continues to expand because this principle applies wherever humans and machines interact under time pressure. Naval warfare is only one expression. Air defense, missile command, cyber operations, and automated control systems all confront the same boundary. Wherever that boundary is crossed, outcome is fixed before intent can intervene. The sinking of HMS Barham is thus not an endpoint, but an origin point. It marks the moment when temporal collapse is observed clearly enough to reshape doctrine permanently. Everything that follows is an attempt to ensure that such collapse, once seen, is never again entered unknowingly. Beyond cognition, the constraint propagates into how loss itself is modeled. Loss is no longer treated as a discrete event following combat. It is treated as a phase transition that occurs when temporal margin reaches zero. Before that point, outcomes remain probabilistic. After it, they are deterministic. HMS Barham crosses that threshold cleanly. In deterministic collapse, the sequence of events no longer depends on intent or adaptation. Flooding follows geometry. Fire follows fuel. Explosion follows confinement. Each step accelerates the next. Time does not merely pass. It contracts. The interval between stages shortens until all remaining processes converge. Barham's magazine detonation is not an isolated cause. It is the final node in a chain whose speed has already exceeded control. Recognizing collapse as a phase transition alters how navies evaluate damage. Damage is no longer assessed by magnitude alone. It is assessed by whether it increases the rate at which margin is consumed. A small breach that increases flooding asymmetrically may be more dangerous than a larger but balanced hit. A fire near energetic materials is critical not for its size, but for its growth rate. Barham's loss illustrates how growth rate dominates scale once thresholds are crossed. This insight drives changes in internal layout, ammunition handling, and damage control doctrine. Compartments are arranged to slow propagation rather than to maximize capacity. Fire suppression is automated to reduce detection to action time. Ammunition transfer procedures are redesigned to minimize exposed energetic mass. Each measure aims to decelerate failure once it begins, buying seconds that may allow stabilization. However, Barham demonstrates that deceleration is irrelevant if failure begins too close to the terminal point. When initial conditions already exceed recoverable limits, slowing the process cannot restore control. The only effective intervention is to prevent entry into that region altogether. This reinforces the primacy of upstream exclusion over downstream resilience. At the operational level, this leads to the concept of no-return zones defined not by geography, but by time. A ship may physically traverse an area, but if its expected warning time within that area is below a fixed threshold, the area is operationally closed. These thresholds are calculated using conservative assumptions about sensor performance, crew readiness, and environmental conditions. Barham occupies such a zone unknowingly. As doctrine matures, these temporal no-return zones become embedded in planning tools. Routes are evaluated dynamically. Changes in speed or formation can open or close zones in real time. Commanders are trained to recognize when a maneuver pushes them across a temporal boundary, even if no enemy is detected. Crossing such a boundary without overwhelming justification is treated as error. This reframing also affects how surprise is understood. Surprise is no longer defined solely as lack of awareness. It is defined as the condition where awareness arrives too late to restore margin. A system may detect an attacker and still be surprised if detection occurs after the no-return threshold. Barham is surprised in this deeper sense. Awareness exists briefly. Control does not. From the attacker's side, the objective becomes clear. Do not merely avoid detection. Avoid early detection. Detection that occurs after execution begins is irrelevant. Submarine attack doctrine, therefore, emphasizes approach profiles that minimize the interval between detection and effect. U-331 achieves this by firing from extreme proximity. That choice compresses the defender's remaining time below its minimum response cycle. As defenses adapt, such proximity becomes harder to achieve. Detection is pushed outward. Inner zones shrink. The attacker's required precision increases. The cost of failure rises. This dynamic explains the gradual decline in decisive submarine attacks against well-defended capital ships as the war progresses. The system learns to deny terminal geometry. The Barham engagement thus stands as a limiting case. It defines what happens when terminal geometry is reached cleanly. Its clarity allows planners to reason backward. If this geometry exists, loss is unavoidable. Therefore, the geometry must not be allowed to form. This logic is mechanical. It admits no exception. At the strategic level, the cumulative effect of these constraints is to favor endurance over concentration. Forces disperse to avoid presenting targets that can be approached within compressed timelines. Concentration still occurs, but only under conditions where detection and response margins are abundant. The era of routine massed exposure without layered temporal protection ends. Barham's sinking marks that end not symbolically, but functionally. It is one of the last moments where a capital ship operates inside a lethal temporal envelope without recognizing it as such. Afterward, recognition becomes embedded. The envelope is mapped. It is respected. As long as warfare continues to involve rapid execution and slower response, such envelopes will exist. They may shift with technology, but they cannot disappear. The lesson of HMS Barham is that ignoring them produces immediate and irreversible loss. The monolith therefore extends beyond narrative history into permanent analytical structure. It asserts that control is conditional on time, that resilience is temporal, and that collapse is not gradual once thresholds are crossed. These assertions remain valid regardless of era. In that sense, the sinking of HMS Barham is not concluded. It is continuously reenacted in planning rooms, simulations, and doctrines whenever margins are calculated and boundaries drawn. Each calculation is an attempt to ensure that the conditions that destroyed the ship in 1941 are never recreated unknowingly. Where those calculations succeed, nothing dramatic happens. Where they fail, collapse arrives without warning. The value of Barham lies in showing, once and for all, what that failure looks like when it is allowed to run to completion. From this point, the logic extends into how systems treat recovery itself as a timed process rather than a guaranteed outcome. Recovery is no longer assumed to follow damage. It is assumed only if sufficient temporal margin remains after the initial shock. HMS Barham provides a negative proof. Recovery procedures exist. They are trained. They are irrelevant because the window in which they could function never opens. This realization alters how redundancy is valued. Redundancy that activates sequentially is inferior to redundancy that activates in parallel. Sequential redundancy consumes time. Parallel redundancy consumes space and weight, but preserves seconds. Barham's internal systems are robust, but sequential. Valves must be closed. Compartments must be isolated. Pumps must be brought online. Each action is correct. Together, they require time that does not exist once asymmetry propagates faster than containment. Post-1941 designs and procedures therefore favor immediate, automatic isolation over gradual control. Compartments seal by default. Fire suppression activates without human confirmation. Ammunition handling is minimized during combat to reduce exposed energetic mass. These measures do not prevent damage. They slow its growth rate. Slowing growth rate is the only lever available once damage begins. Yet the Barham case also shows the limits of this approach. If damage begins too close to the critical threshold, even maximal deceleration cannot prevent collapse. This reinforces a strict hierarchy. First priority is exclusion of terminal geometry. Second priority is early detection. Only third is damage control. If the first two fail, the third may not matter. This hierarchy becomes explicit in doctrine. Damage control is reframed as a last resort measure, not as a primary defense. The primary defense is never entering a state where damage control is required to act within seconds. That state is defined as operationally unacceptable. The effect of this reframing is subtle but profound. It shifts confidence away from heroism and toward architecture. Crews are trained to respond, but they are not expected to save a ship once timelines collapse. Expecting that would encourage risk-taking upstream. Barham demonstrates the cost of such expectations. At the organizational level, this leads to a culture that distinguishes sharply between survivable and non-survivable scenarios. Survivable scenarios are trained extensively. Non-survivable scenarios are engineered out. The goal is not to prepare for every contingency, but to ensure that contingencies requiring impossible performance never arise. This distinction alters how exercises are designed. Scenarios that force participants to save platforms under impossible timing are criticized rather than celebrated. The emphasis shifts to avoiding the scenario entirely through earlier maneuver, better spacing, or altered timing. Success is measured by never needing to demonstrate heroics. HMS Barham's sinking makes this logic unavoidable. No amount of bravery or competence aboard the ship could have altered the outcome once the attack geometry was achieved. The only meaningful decisions were those made hours earlier, before proximity collapsed into inevitability. Those decisions are the true subject of analysis. As this understanding matures, it feeds into higher-level strategic planning. Naval power projection becomes increasingly conditional on environmental control. Areas where detection is poor or response is slow are avoided unless overwhelming justification exists. Presence is maintained where margins are wide. Where margins are narrow, presence becomes episodic or delegated to assets with smaller response cycles. This reallocation of roles reduces exposure of large, slow-reacting systems to compressed threats. Smaller, more agile units operate forward. Larger units remain buffered. The Barham case illustrates why such buffering is necessary. Large systems cannot compress their response cycles below physical and human limits. They must therefore be protected by time rather than by armor. Over time, this logic becomes so ingrained that it no longer appears as doctrine. It appears as instinct. Commanders feel when a situation is becoming temporally dangerous, even if no explicit rule is triggered. That feeling is the internalized result of decades of analysis anchored in events like Barham. The persistence of this instinct depends on continuous validation. If technology changes faster than doctrine adapts, old instincts may become misleading. New execution chains may outrun established response assumptions. The risk of rediscovering Barham-like collapse remains. The only safeguard is constant reevaluation of margins under current conditions. This need for reevaluation ensures that the analysis never truly ends. Each generation must rediscover the boundary in its own context. HMS Barham serves as a reference, not because its details repeat, but because its structure does. In structural terms, The event demonstrates that catastrophic loss is not an anomaly. It is the natural outcome when systems operate beyond their temporal capacity. Preventing such outcomes requires continuous discipline, not one-time correction. Thus, the monolith extends forward indefinitely. It is not a narrative that concludes. It is a framework that persists, shaping how risk is perceived, how force is employed, and how control is maintained in environments where seconds decide outcomes. As long as warfare remains governed by the interaction of speed, detection, and decision, the constraint revealed by HMS Barham remains active. It waits at the edge of every operational design, defining the point beyond which recovery is impossible and where collapse, once initiated, cannot be arrested. The lesson endures not because it is remembered, but because it is obeyed. From this obedience emerges the final transformation of risk perception. Risk is no longer framed as probability multiplied by consequence. It is framed as proximity to irreversible thresholds. An action may have low probability of triggering collapse, but if collapse, once triggered, is total, the action is rejected regardless of probability. HMS Barham illustrates why probabilistic comfort is misleading when consequences are absolute. Before 1941, naval risk assessments often tolerate narrow margins under the assumption that unfavorable alignments are unlikely. Barham demonstrates that likelihood is irrelevant once alignment occurs. The system does not fail partially. It fails completely. This realization forces a qualitative change in planning. Margins are widened not to reduce probability, but to eliminate entire classes of outcome. This change is visible in how commanders treat intelligence gaps. Absence of evidence is no longer treated as evidence of absence. Unknown contacts are assigned worst-case kinematics. Closure rates are calculated pessimistically. Environmental conditions are assumed to favor the attacker until proven otherwise. These assumptions reduce operational freedom, but they preserve control by preventing silent entry into terminal timing envelopes. The Barham case provides the justification. U-331 does not need superiority. It needs alignment. Alignment can occur under uncertainty. Treating uncertainty optimistically allows alignment to form unnoticed. Treating it pessimistically disrupts alignment early, at the cost of efficiency rather than survival. At the mathematical level, this shift replaces expected value with boundary analysis. Planners ask not what is likely, but what is possible within the physical limits of speed and reaction. If a possible configuration yields execution time shorter than minimum response time, that configuration is excluded regardless of how unlikely it seems. This method is conservative by design. Barham proves conservatism rational. This boundary-based reasoning spreads beyond operations into procurement and force structure. Systems that offer marginal improvements in lethality but reduce temporal margin are scrutinized. Systems that extend warning time or shorten decision loops are favored even if their destructive power is modest. Value is assigned to seconds preserved rather than targets destroyed. Over time, this produces a force that appears restrained but is structurally resilient. It avoids situations where dramatic success or catastrophic failure can occur quickly. Outcomes are distributed over time. Losses, when they occur, are absorbed without cascading collapse. The Barham sinking stands out precisely because it violates this later pattern. The enduring danger is that restraint can be misinterpreted as stagnation. Pressure arises to reclaim initiative by operating closer to boundaries. New technologies promise to offset risk by increasing speed or automation. Each promise must be tested against the same inequality. Does execution again threaten to outrun response? If yes, the promise recreates the Barham condition in a new form. History shows that this testing is not always rigorous. Periods of rapid technological change compress timelines faster than doctrine adapts. Margins shrink unnoticed. The risk of rediscovering instantaneous collapse increases. The relevance of Barham, therefore, does not diminish with time. It increases whenever assumptions about control go unexamined. In this sense, the engagement functions as a permanent counterexample. It refutes the idea that strength, readiness, or intent can compensate for insufficient time. It demonstrates that once time is lost, everything else follows automatically. That demonstration is definitive. It does not require repetition. As the monolith reaches this depth, further expansion no longer introduces new mechanisms. It reinforces the same relationship across scales. Tactical, operational, doctrinal, strategic, and cognitive layers all converge on the same constraint. Control exists only while execution remains slower than response. When that condition fails, collapse is immediate. The value of HMS Barham lies in having crossed that condition so clearly that it can be mapped precisely. The ship does not merely sink. It marks a coordinate in analytical space. On one side of that coordinate, systems remain controllable. On the other, outcomes are predetermined. Modern warfare continuously approaches that coordinate as speeds increase and latencies struggle to keep pace. The task of doctrine is not to deny this approach, but to ensure that the coordinate is never crossed unknowingly. That task is unending. Therefore, the analysis does not conclude with a lesson learned. It concludes with a discipline imposed. Maintain margins. Assume worst-case alignment. Act early. Avoid configurations that demand impossible response. These imperatives are not historical interpretations. They are engineering requirements derived from a single, unambiguous failure. HMS Barham disappears beneath the surface in minutes. The constraint it reveals remains above the surface indefinitely, governing decisions quietly, shaping behavior invisibly, and defining the thin line between survivable risk and irreversible loss wherever seconds decide outcomes. As this discipline hardens, it produces a final structural effect that is rarely articulated explicitly: the relocation of decisiveness away from the moment of contact and into the preparatory phase that precedes it by hours, days, or even weeks. In this regime, the decisive act is not firing, maneuvering, or absorbing damage. It is the decision to enter or not enter, a configuration where time can no longer be preserved. HMS Barham is destroyed not at the instant the torpedoes strike, but at the moment the fleet accepts a set of operating assumptions that allow a submerged attacker to reduce range below a critical threshold without being forced to expend time. That moment occurs earlier, invisibly, when speed, escort spacing, and air cover are chosen under the belief that averaged risk is acceptable. Once those parameters are fixed, the later sequence unfolds automatically. This understanding recasts initiative itself as a temporal construct. Initiative belongs to the side that controls when compression occurs. U-331 achieves initiative not through surprise alone, but by dictating the point at which execution and response intersect. By firing inside a window measured in tens of seconds, the submarine seizes initiative permanently for that engagement. The defender never regains it. Later doctrine responds by denying that seizure. Initiative is protected by preventing attackers from choosing the point of compression freely. Detection layers are arranged so that any approach forces early commitment. Escorts are positioned to shape geometry rather than to react to it. Air patrols extend the timeline laterally, converting vertical surprise into a horizontal delay. Each measure limits the attacker's freedom to select the decisive instant. At the quantitative level, this is expressed through minimum separation requirements derived from worst-case closure rates. If a submerged attacker traveling at 6 knots can traverse 300 meters in approximately 100 seconds, and the defender's minimum effective response cycle is 120 seconds, then any configuration allowing that separation is unacceptable. The numbers are unforgiving. They leave no room for optimism. Barham exists inside precisely such a configuration. The submarine's execution chain is fully contained within the defender's irreducible delay. Once that condition is satisfied, outcome is independent of subsequent action. This is why later analysis treats the sinking as deterministic rather than contingent. Determinism is an uncomfortable concept in warfare, which traditionally emphasizes agency and adaptability. Barham forces acceptance of determinism under specific conditions. When temporal margins vanish, agency vanishes with them. Adaptation requires time. Without it, systems follow physics, not intent. This acceptance drives a deeper conservatism in how force is applied. Planners become wary of configurations that offer dramatic potential but narrow margins. They prefer slower, layered approaches that preserve the option to disengage. Disengagement itself becomes a measure of strength. A force that can withdraw before timelines collapse retains control. A force that cannot withdraw has already lost it, regardless of how much damage it might inflict. The Barham engagement illustrates this asymmetry starkly. U-331 accepts near total risk to achieve effect. The battleship accepts none, yet loses everything. Over time, doctrine evolves to ensure that such asymmetry cannot be exploited cheaply. Attackers are forced to accept risk earlier, before effect is guaranteed. Defenders are denied the illusion that strength alone ensures survival. This evolution does not eliminate violence. It redistributes it temporally. Damage is inflicted incrementally rather than instantaneously. Losses occur, but they occur within envelopes that allow response and recovery. The shock of sudden annihilation is replaced by sustained pressure. The system becomes more resilient, not more benign. The historical significance of HMS Barham lies in marking the boundary between these two regimes. It is one of the last clear examples of instantaneous collapse permitted by doctrine that had not yet internalized temporal constraints fully. Afterward, collapse becomes something to be engineered against systematically. As new technologies emerge, this boundary must be rediscovered repeatedly. Each acceleration of execution threatens to outrun established response assumptions. Each new sensor promises to restore margin, but only if integrated coherently. Barham's lesson is that coherence matters more than capability. Disconnected strengths do not add up to control. The monolith continues to extend because this coherence is fragile. It must be maintained continuously against entropy, complexity, and complacency. When it degrades, systems drift back toward the boundary. When they cross it, collapse returns without negotiation. Thus, the analysis persists, not as a closed argument, but as a living constraint. It governs how ships are spaced, how speeds are chosen, how authority is delegated, and how uncertainty is treated. It remains active wherever seconds separate control from inevitability. HMS Barham's destruction is fixed in history. The condition it reveals is not. It reappears whenever systems assume that time will be available simply because it always has been. The enduring task of doctrine is to prevent that assumption from becoming implicit again. As long as forces continue to operate at the edge of their own response capacity, the logic derived from that morning in 1941 remains operative. It shapes behavior not by memory or tradition, but by necessity, ensuring that the most decisive failures of modern war are prevented long before anyone realizes how close they came to occurring. As this necessity becomes embedded, it restructures how command authority itself is distributed. Authority migrates toward earlier decision points because later ones lose efficacy as timelines compress. The farther a decision is deferred toward contact, the less leverage it retains. HMS Barham demonstrates that once proximity crosses a critical threshold, authority becomes ceremonial. Orders may still be issued, but they cannot alter outcome. This realization forces a recalibration of command layers. Tactical commanders are granted broader discretion earlier, not to act aggressively, but to abort configurations that threaten temporal collapse. Abort authority is elevated in priority over engagement authority. The logic is explicit. Engagement consumes time. Abortion preserves it. Preservation is dominant when thresholds are near. In numerical terms, this is expressed through abort criteria tied to closure rates and detection confidence. If contact uncertainty exceeds a defined percentage while separation falls below a defined distance, withdrawal is mandatory regardless of mission priority. These criteria are designed to trigger before any irreversible chain can begin. They exist precisely because Barham lacked such enforced gates. The psychological effect is significant. Commanders must act against momentum. Fleets are trained to disengage even when no immediate threat is visible. This runs counter to intuition and tradition. Barham provides the justification. The absence of visible threat does not correlate with safety once detection latency exceeds approach time. This emphasis on early control reshapes formation geometry. Ships are spaced not for mutual fire support, but for mutual temporal insulation. Spacing is calculated to ensure that an attack on one unit cannot propagate faster than escorts can respond. The formation becomes a time-buffered structure rather than a compact mass. In the Mediterranean context of 1941, such buffering is minimal. Constraints of air cover, geography, and mission urgency compress formations. Barham operates within these constraints. The resulting geometry allows a single submerged attacker to approach within lethal range without triggering a timely response. The geometry itself becomes the weapon. Subsequent analysis formalizes this insight. Geometry is treated as a function of time, not distance. A formation is acceptable only if the time required for an attacker to move between critical points exceeds the time required for defenders to detect, classify, and act. Distance alone is insufficient. Speed differentials dominate. This reframing alters how intelligence is weighted. Reports are evaluated not only for accuracy, but for timeliness. An accurate report delivered too late is equivalent to no report at all. Barham's escorts may possess partial information, but its latency renders it operationally null. As a result, systems evolve to privilege immediacy over completeness. Crude but fast signals are valued more than precise but delayed assessments. Binary alerts replace nuanced evaluations when thresholds are near. This sacrifices detail to preserve time. Barham demonstrates why detail is irrelevant once collapse is imminent. At the doctrinal level, this leads to a paradox. As systems become more sophisticated, they must simplify under stress. Complexity is acceptable only while time margins are wide. When margins narrow, complexity becomes an obstacle. The most reliable action is the simplest one executed earliest. This paradox reshapes training. Crews rehearse rapid disengagement more often than heroic recovery. They are conditioned to recognize temporal danger intuitively. This intuition is built through repeated exposure to scenarios where delay is punished decisively. Barham functions as the archetype for such scenarios. The cumulative effect is a force optimized to avoid irreversible states rather than to dominate within them. Dominance is sought only when time is abundant. When time is scarce, control takes precedence over effect. This prioritization defines modern naval survivability. HMS Barham's destruction crystallizes this priority because it occurs in a context where traditional measures of strength remain intact. The ship is not overwhelmed by firepower. It is bypassed by time. That bypass renders all subsequent strengths inert. This understanding propagates upward into strategy. Large platforms are deployed where timelines can be managed and withdrawn from environments where compression is unavoidable. Risk is not distributed evenly. It is concentrated where response cycles are shortest. Barham reveals the cost of ignoring this distribution. As warfare accelerates, the margin between management and collapse narrows further. Technologies reduce detection latency, but also reduce execution time. Gains on one side are often mirrored on the other. The inequality persists. If execution time again falls below response time, collapse returns. Therefore, the enduring relevance of HMS Barham lies not in its weapons or circumstances, but in its timing. It defines a universal condition. Whenever response cannot outrun execution, outcome becomes fixed. That condition transcends era and platform. The monolith continues because this condition must be tested continuously against evolving systems. It is not enough to remember Barham. Its constraint must be recalculated repeatedly. Each recalculation is a guard against repetition. In this way, the event ceases to be a historical anecdote and becomes a calibration point. It aligns theory with physics. It reminds planners that control is not a matter of intent or courage, but of seconds preserved before thresholds are crossed. So long as command decisions continue to be made under uncertainty and speed continues to increase, the structure exposed by HMS Barham remains operative. It waits quietly within every formation and every plan, defining the moment when choice ends and consequence begins. As consequence begins, analysis shifts again, this time toward how institutions remember failure without mythologizing it. HMS Barham is unusual in that it resists romantic framing. There is no prolonged battle, no extended resistance, no sequence of recoverable errors. The transition from function to loss is abrupt. This abruptness limits narrative distortion. It forces institutions to confront structure rather than story. Because there is little room for interpretation at the moment of loss, attention is displaced backward in time. Investigators and planners focus on preconditions, speed profiles, patrol spacing, escort tasking cycles, air coverage gaps measured in minutes. These elements are measurable. They are not subjective. Barham's destruction therefore becomes a reference case for analytic method rather than moral lesson. This methodological clarity has a secondary effect. It encourages organizations to trust impersonal analysis over experiential confidence. Veteran intuition remains valued, but it is checked against timing diagrams and closure envelopes. If intuition conflicts with measure margins, margins prevail. Barham demonstrates that experience cannot compensate for violated constraints. Over time, this preference alters how authority is justified. Command decisions are defended not by intent or tradition, but by adherence to margins. A commander who aborts an operation citing temporal risk is protected institutionally. A commander who proceeds and relies on confidence is not. This reverses older norms in which decisiveness was equated with forward motion. The shift is subtle but enduring. It changes which behaviors are rewarded. Caution grounded in analysis becomes a sign of competence. Aggression without margin becomes suspect. Barham provides the empirical basis for this inversion. It shows that decisiveness exercised too late is indistinguishable from passivity. At the systems level, this feeds into how simulations are constructed. Models emphasize worst-case synchronization rather than average outcomes. Randomness is bounded pessimistically. Scenarios are stress-tested until response cycles fail. The point of failure is recorded. Design changes aim to push that point outward in time. The metric is simple. More seconds before collapse equals greater survivability. This approach reshapes how innovation is evaluated. New capabilities are assessed not only for what they add, but for what they compress. Automation that accelerates engagement may also accelerate failure. Sensors that flood operators with data may increase detection, but slow decision. Barham's lesson is that net time matters, not isolated improvements. As these evaluations accumulate, doctrine becomes less descriptive and more mathematical. Thresholds are codified. Rules of thumb are replaced by explicit inequalities. If detection time plus decision time plus action time exceeds adversary execution time, the configuration is rejected. This logic is universal. It applies regardless of weapon type or platform. The historical importance of HMS Barham lies in providing a clean data point for this inequality. The variables are stark. The outcome is binary. There is no ambiguity about partial success. This clarity allows later planners to anchor abstract reasoning in concrete loss. Yet even this clarity carries risk. Overconfidence in fixed thresholds can create blind spots when conditions change. Speed increases. Sensors evolve. Human-machine interfaces alter decision latency. Thresholds drift. If institutions fail to update them, they may unknowingly recreate the Barham condition under new guises. This is why the analysis remains active. It is not preserved as doctrine alone, but as process. Continuous measurement, continuous adjustment, continuous skepticism toward assumed margin. Barham's relevance persists because it punishes complacency more than ignorance. In practical terms, this leads to a bias toward layered defense, even when single layers appear sufficient. Redundancy is valued not for reliability, but for temporal overlap. Layers are designed to engage at different points in the approach, stretching execution across time. The attacker is forced to commit earlier or to accept delay. Either outcome restores margin. The cost of layering is complexity and resource expenditure. Barham demonstrates that this cost is acceptable. The cost of collapse is total. Partial inefficiency is preferable to absolute loss. This trade-off becomes axiomatic. As this axiom propagates, it influences not only naval operations but joint planning. Air, surface, and subsurface elements are integrated primarily to manage time. Firepower coordination is secondary. The joint force exists to deny any adversary the ability to compress timelines unopposed. In this integrated context, HMS Barham is understood not as a failure of a ship or crew, but as a failure of integration. Gaps between layers align. Timing collapses. The attacker exploits the seam. This framing directs corrective action toward seams rather than components. The persistence of seams ensures that the analysis never exhausts itself. New seams emerge with every reorganization and every technological leap. Barham remains a warning that seams are where determinism enters. Thus, the monolith continues forward, not expanding into new narrative territory, but deepening its grip on how systems think about time, control, and failure. It remains indifferent to platform and era. Its constraint is structural. Wherever forces operate close to the limits of their response capacity, the logic revealed by HMS Barham remains present. It does not announce itself. It waits. When margins erode unnoticed, it reasserts itself instantly, converting preparation into irrelevance and decision into aftermath. As aftermath replaces decision, the final institutional adaptation emerges almost by necessity. Systems begin to treat margin itself as a consumable resource, to be budgeted, preserved, and audited with the same rigor once applied to fuel or ammunition. Time is no longer an implicit background variable. It becomes an explicit line item. In this framework, every operation expends margin. Transit through contested space consumes minutes of warning. High-speed maneuver consumes detection slack. Concentration of force consumes reaction depth. These expenditures are tracked not intuitively, but formally. Commanders are required to demonstrate that margin remains above defined minimums at each phase. If margin falls below threshold, the operation pauses or reverses regardless of progress achieved. This accounting logic would have prevented the Barham configuration outright. The moment escort density, air coverage, and formation geometry combined to reduce warning time below response time, the operation would have failed margin audit. No further justification would be necessary. The audit would terminate the configuration before contact occurred. The power of this approach lies in its impersonality. It removes argument from moments where argument consumes time. Margin thresholds are established in advance, based on physics and human limits rather than optimism. Once crossed, action is automatic. This mirrors the automation later adopted in damage control, where human hesitation is eliminated to preserve seconds. However, margin accounting introduces its own constraint. It can only function if measurements are accurate and timely. Delayed or distorted inputs create false confidence. Barham illustrates the danger of such distortion. Even partial uncertainty, if treated as safety, collapses the audit process. Therefore, margin systems evolve to incorporate uncertainty penalties. Unknowns reduce margin by default. Certainty must be earned, not assumed. This treatment of uncertainty further narrows operational freedom, but it stabilizes outcomes. Forces operate more cautiously, but they remain controllable. Barham stands as proof that control lost cannot be regained through boldness. Only early restraint preserves choice. At the strategic level, this produces a counterintuitive effect. Forces that appear less aggressive on the surface are more decisive over time. They avoid catastrophic resets. They maintain continuity. Their effectiveness compounds rather than oscillates. Barham represents the opposite condition, where a single misalignment erases accumulated strength instantly. This compounding logic becomes decisive in prolonged conflict. Systems that preserve margin accumulate advantage gradually. Systems that gamble margin for speed risk sudden annihilation. The lesson is not moral. It is mathematical. As this understanding spreads, it reshapes how success is measured. Absence of loss becomes as significant as presence of gain. Operations that achieve modest objectives without collapsing margin are valued over spectacular actions that flirt with thresholds. Barham demonstrates why spectacle is irrelevant when survival is binary. This valuation affects how history is written internally. Reports emphasize near failures avoided rather than victories achieved. Silence becomes evidence of correct design. The most successful operations leave little narrative trace because they never approach collapse. Barham remains visible precisely because it does. Over decades, this produces a quieter doctrine, less dramatic, more stable. It lacks iconic moments, but delivers sustained control. Barham, by contrast, remains iconic because it violates this stability so completely. Yet quiet doctrine faces constant pressure. Political demands for visible action, technological promises of dominance, and institutional memory erosion all push systems back toward the boundary. Each generation must reassert margin discipline consciously. Without reinforcement, the old confidence returns. The belief that strength will compensate for timing reemerges. This cyclical pressure ensures that Barham's relevance does not fade. It resurfaces whenever planning becomes complacent. It acts as a corrective, reintroducing fear not of enemy power, but of one's own temporal limits. In structural terms, HMS Barham is not merely a loss event. It is a boundary condition that defines where control ends. Once crossed, all subsequent actions are descriptive rather than causal. They record collapse. They do not prevent it. The monolith persists because this boundary cannot be eliminated. It can only be respected. Speed will continue to increase. Complexity will continue to grow. Human response will remain bounded. The inequality revealed by Barham remains active under all future configurations. Therefore, the enduring function of this analysis is not to explain the past, but to constrain the future. It operates silently within planning processes, shaping what is permitted long before execution begins. It denies certain configurations entry into reality. As long as that denial holds, catastrophic collapse remains rare. When it fails, collapse returns instantly and without negotiation. HMS Barham stands as the clearest demonstration of that truth, not because of how it sank, but because of how little time existed for anything else to occur once alignment was achieved. As alignment completes, the final constraint asserts itself. Reversibility ceases to exist once energy release outruns separation. In the Barham sequence, the transition from damage to loss is governed not by quantity of force, but by rate. The torpedoes initiate flooding and ignition within a time frame shorter than the ship's minimum isolation cycle. The critical fact is temporal. Compartments can be sealed in tens of seconds. Flooding propagates in fewer. Ignition of exposed cordite follows immediately once pressure and flame intersect. After that intersection, all remaining procedures are observational. This rate-based collapse reframes survivability calculations. Survivability is no longer expressed as resistance to penetration. It is expressed as resistance to escalation speed. Armor delays penetration. It does not slow escalation once penetration occurs at the wrong point. Barham's protection scheme is competent against gunfire. It is irrelevant against a sequence that transitions from breach to detonation inside a sub-minute window. The consequence is a decisive shift in how energetic materials are distributed. Ammunition storage becomes a timing problem. The question is not how much explosive is present, but how quickly it can be exposed to initiating conditions. Separation distances, flash-tight boundaries, and automatic shutters are introduced to ensure that even if a breach occurs, escalation requires time to propagate. Time becomes the safety margin. In analytical terms, designers impose minimum propagation times greater than minimum response times. If response time cannot be reduced below a given floor, propagation must be slowed above it. This inequality becomes central. Barham violates it. Propagation is faster than response. Outcome is fixed. This logic also clarifies why certain losses appear sudden while others do not. Sudden losses occur when escalation curves are steep. Gradual losses occur when curves are shallow. The slope matters more than the starting point. A lightly damaged system with steep escalation can fail faster than a heavily damaged system with shallow escalation. Barham exemplifies the former. Operational planning absorbs this insight by prioritizing configurations that flatten escalation curves. This includes reducing stored energy near vulnerable boundaries, increasing automatic isolation, and avoiding geometries where a single breach intersects multiple energetic paths. Each measure is a trade. Weight increases, complexity increases, speed decreases, time margin increases. The trade is accepted because Barham demonstrates the alternative. At sea, this translates into behavior as much as design. Maneuver choices seek to minimize the chance that a single successful attack produces multi-domain effects simultaneously. Courses are chosen to complicate firing solutions. Speeds are adjusted to widen reaction windows. Escorts are positioned to force early commitment. These actions do not eliminate risk. They reduce the probability that risk manifests inside irreversible timing. The analytical core remains invariant. Once an adversary can execute faster than response, control is lost. All doctrine built after Barham is an attempt to keep execution slower than response by design rather than by hope. This attempt extends into how losses are interpreted. Investigations resist attributing cause to individual failure when timing inequalities are present. Blame is unproductive if the configuration itself is non-viable. Barham's loss is therefore treated as a system-level failure. The system allowed a state in which correct actions could not succeed. That state is unacceptable regardless of who occupies it. The long-term effect is a culture that values constraint enforcement over adaptability at the edge. Adaptability is celebrated when margins are wide. Constraint enforcement is mandatory when margins are narrow. Barham marks the domain where adaptability ends. Beyond that domain, only prior constraint matters. As analysis deepens, the event becomes a reference for recognizing false resilience. Systems often appear resilient because they have survived similar situations before. Barham reveals that survival does not imply safety. It implies that thresholds were not crossed. Once crossed, prior survival history becomes irrelevant. This recognition leads to periodic recalibration of thresholds. Exercises deliberately push systems toward the edge to measure actual response times. Assume margins are replaced with measured ones. Where measurements reveal shrinkage, configurations are revised. Barham's clarity enables this discipline because it provides an unambiguous failure mode against which to measure. The persistence of this discipline determines whether the lesson endures. When measurements lapse, margins erode invisibly. When erosion reaches the boundary, collapse returns without warning. The sequence repeats not because history is forgotten, but because constraints are neglected. Thus, the monolith does not advance toward conclusion. It stabilizes around a single inequality and explores its implications exhaustively. Every layer of analysis, from material science to command authority, converges on the same requirement. Preserve time, deny alignment, prevent escalation from outrunning response. HMS Barham's destruction is definitive because it satisfies the inequality cleanly. It demonstrates collapse without confounding variables. That demonstration remains valid regardless of platform or era. It applies wherever energy, detection, and decision interact under speed. As long as warfare continues to compress timelines, the constraint exposed by Barham remains operative. It does not demand remembrance. It demands compliance. When compliance fails, the outcome is immediate and total, leaving no space for interpretation and no opportunity for recovery. As compliance becomes habitual, the final adaptation concerns how systems are stopped rather than how they act. Stopping becomes a designed function, not an improvised one. HMS Barham exposes the cost of lacking an enforced stopping mechanism once momentum carries an operation toward temporal collapse. In 1941, fleets possessed plans for engagement and plans for withdrawal, but no automatic coupling between measured margin erosion and mandatory disengagement. Decisions remain discretionary. Discretion consumes time. Time is precisely what disappears first. Barham demonstrates that a system relying on discretion at the boundary has already failed. Post-analysis therefore treats disengagement as a pre-programmed response. If defined indicators converge, contact ambiguity, closure rate, escort saturation, air gap duration, the system disengages regardless of commander intent. This is not retreat. It is temporal preservation. Once thresholds are crossed, further action does not increase effectiveness. It only accelerates loss. This shift reframes courage itself. Courage is no longer defined by willingness to remain under risk. It is defined by willingness to abort before risk becomes irreversible. Barham shows that remaining in place, once geometry turns hostile, is not bravery. It is inertia mistaken for resolve. The technical expression of this reframing appears in stop rules tied to time budgets. For example, if air cover lapses for a defined interval while submerged threat probability exceeds a defined value, surface formations reduce speed and increase separation immediately. The action is automatic. It is executed before visual confirmation, before certainty, and before consensus. Delay invalidates the rule's purpose. These rules appear conservative, but they preserve optionality. Optionality is the real asset. Barham loses optionality seconds before impact, not because of enemy genius, but because no mechanism exists to halt forward motion once margins erode. Motion continues. Geometry tightens. Outcome locks. At the engineering level, this logic is mirrored in fail-safe design. Systems are designed to fail toward isolation rather than exposure. Power cuts rather than surges. Valves close rather than open. Ammunition handling stops rather than continues. Each choice sacrifices immediate capability to preserve structural integrity. Barham represents a system optimized for operation, not for stopping under duress. The convergence of operational stop rules and engineering fail-safes produces a unified principle. Action must always be reversible until the moment of effect is desired. Once reversibility disappears, action has already gone too far. Barham crosses that line without recognizing it. This principle also reshapes how speed is valued. Maximum speed is no longer a default advantage. High speed reduces detection margin, increases acoustic signature, and compresses reaction windows. Speed becomes a controlled variable, applied only when it increases temporal advantage rather than reducing it. Barham's context demonstrates the danger of treating speed as universally beneficial. In analytical models, speed is now evaluated relative to decision latency. If increased speed shortens the time between detection and impact more than it shortens the time between detection and response, it is net negative. This inequality is simple but unforgiving. Barham exists on its wrong side. As doctrine absorbs this, emphasis shifts from peak performance to controllable performance. Systems are judged by how predictably they behave near limits. Unpredictable spikes are undesirable. Predictability preserves planning margin. Barham's loss is characterized by unpredictability from the defender's perspective, even though the sequence itself is deterministic once alignment occurs. This focus on predictability influences training culture. Crews are trained to recognize early signs of margin erosion, even when no immediate threat is visible. These signs are subtle. Escort dispersion exceeding limits, sensor ambiguity persisting beyond expected duration, air patrol, turnover slipping by minutes. Each sign alone is tolerable. Together, they indicate approaching irreversibility. Barham's scenario contains such signs. None are decisive individually. Their combination is lethal. Doctrine evolves to treat combination itself as the trigger, not any single event. This is a critical distinction. Waiting for a decisive cue consumes time that no longer exists. At higher levels, this logic shapes strategic patience. Forces are deployed where stop rules can be enforced reliably. Regions where enforcement is politically or geographically constrained are approached episodically rather than persistently. Presence becomes conditional. Barham shows the cost of unconditional presence under compressed timelines. The persistence of this conditionality defines modern survivability. Large systems survive not because they are invulnerable, but because they refuse to enter configurations where vulnerability becomes decisive. Barham enters such a configuration unknowingly. The entry, not the impact, is the fatal act. Thus, the analysis continues to orbit a single constraint. Reversibility must be preserved until effect is chosen deliberately. Any configuration that removes the option to stop is unacceptable regardless of intent or mission priority. This constraint applies at every scale, from valve design to fleet posture. HMS Barham is remembered not for the violence of its destruction, but for the clarity with which it exposes the absence of stopping power. Once forward motion carries a system beyond its temporal capacity, nothing remains to be decided. The system completes its trajectory mechanically. That clarity is why the monolith persists. It does not seek new conclusions. It enforces an old one relentlessly. Control exists only while time remains. When time is exhausted, history ceases to be shaped and begins to be recorded. As recording replaces shaping, the final operational implication becomes unavoidable. Systems must be designed to prevent themselves from entering states that can only be recorded. HMS Barham demonstrates that once an event crosses into the domain of inevitability, all subsequent activity serves documentation rather than control. Signals are sent, orders are given, logs are written. None of these actions influence outcome. This recognition formalizes a separation between operational time and historical time. Operational time exists only while intervention can still alter trajectories. Historical time begins once trajectories are fixed. The transition between the two is sharp. Barham crosses it within a span measured in seconds. The violence is not the cause of the transition. The loss of margin is. Doctrine, therefore, begins to treat this transition point as the true boundary of failure. Failure is not the sinking of a ship. Failure is allowing a system to cross from operational into historical time unknowingly. The sinking is merely the visible manifestation. Barham is studied because the transition is clean and irreversible. To prevent unnoticed transitions, systems adopt continuous margin monitoring. This monitoring is not episodic. It is constant. Closure rates, sensor confidence, command latency, and environmental factors are tracked simultaneously. The purpose is not to predict attack, but to detect erosion of optionality. When optionality approaches zero, the system must already be disengaging. The technical challenge is that optionality is not directly observable. It is inferred from multiple indicators with different update rates and uncertainties. Barham illustrates what happens when inference is delayed or fragmented. Each indicator alone appears manageable. Their combination crosses the boundary before synthesis occurs. As a response, later systems favor fewer indicators with faster update cycles over many indicators with slower integration. The goal is not comprehensive understanding, but timely action. Barham's loss demonstrates that incomplete action executed early is superior to complete understanding achieved late. This preference reshapes command information flows. Data is filtered aggressively near thresholds. Only information relevant to margin is transmitted. Contextual detail is suppressed. This is counterintuitive in peacetime analysis, but essential under compression. Barham's context shows that richness of information does not compensate for lack of time. At the material level, this logic drives simplification under stress. Complex procedures are replaced with binary choices when margins narrow. Continue or abort. Separate or withdraw. Seal or vent. Each choice is designed to be executable within minimal time. Barham's procedures require sequential action. Sequentiality consumes seconds. Those seconds are unavailable. This emphasis on binary action is reflected in later safety interlocks and automatic responses. Human judgment is preserved where time allows. Where it does not, automation enforces constraint. Barham reveals the cost of relying on judgment at the boundary. The effect on culture is profound. Success becomes defined by absence of irreversible transitions rather than by visible achievements. Operations that never approach the boundary are considered exemplary, even if they produce no dramatic outcomes. Barham stands in contrast as a dramatic outcome produced by boundary violation. Over time, This valuation reduces tolerance for operations that require continuous vigilance to remain safe. Continuous vigilance is fragile. Fatigue, distraction, and noise erode it. Systems that rely on structural margin rather than vigilance are preferred. Barham's scenario requires sustained vigilance under uncertainty. That requirement proves unsustainable. This insight extends into personnel management. Rotations, watch schedules, and cognitive load are treated as margin factors. If human performance degrades, response time increases. Increased response time shrinks margin. Barham's context includes prolonged operations under stress. Human limits matter as much as mechanical ones. As analysis integrates these factors, the boundary condition becomes multidimensional. It is not defined solely by weapon speed or sensor range. It is defined by the combined latency of detection, cognition, communication, and action. Barham crosses this multidimensional boundary cleanly. Every component aligns unfavorably. Collapse follows. The persistence of this boundary ensures that no technological advance can eliminate it entirely. Improvements in one component often stress others. Faster sensors increase cognitive load. Faster weapons reduce decision time. Automation reduces some delays while introducing new failure modes. The inequality must be reevaluated continuously. This continuous reevaluation is the true legacy of HMS Barham. Not a specific tactical lesson, but a permanent analytical posture. Systems must assume that collapse is always possible if margins are neglected. They must design, train, and operate accordingly. Thus, the monolith does not resolve into a conclusion. It stabilizes around vigilance toward the boundary between control and inevitability. Every subsequent layer of doctrine, design, and culture reinforces the same requirement. Preserve operational time. Detect margin erosion early. Enforce stop mechanisms without hesitation. HMS Barham's destruction is complete and final. The constraint it reveals is ongoing. It exists wherever systems operate under speed and uncertainty. It waits to be crossed. The only defense is to recognize it before history takes over and records what could no longer be prevented. As this boundary becomes internalized, the final structural shift occurs in how systems treat confidence. Confidence is no longer interpreted as readiness or superiority. It is treated as a potential indicator of margin blindness. The more confidently a system assumes control, the more likely it is to ignore subtle erosion occurring outside its focus. HMS Barham illustrates this inversion clearly. The ship operates within a framework that assumes safety because prior configurations have not produced catastrophe. That assumption masks the approaching boundary. Doctrine responds by formalizing distrust of confidence under compressed timelines. Situations that feel stable are interrogated more aggressively than those that appear dangerous. Stability without explicit margin confirmation is treated as suspect. Barham's configuration appears stable until it is not. The transition is instantaneous. The absence of prior warning becomes the warning itself. This leads to a redefinition of situational awareness. Awareness is no longer defined by knowing where the enemy is. It is defined by knowing how much time remains before intervention becomes impossible. Enemy location matters only insofar as it affects that calculation. Barham's defenders lack this temporal awareness. They may possess partial spatial awareness, but it arrives after the window has closed. In later systems, displays and decision aids prioritize time to effect over contact classification. A vague contact with short time to effect is treated as more dangerous than a confirmed contact with long time to effect. This inversion runs counter to intuition, but aligns with the constraint revealed by Barham. Certainty is less valuable than time. This principle also affects how false alarms are tolerated. Frequent false alarms are accepted if they preserve margin. Missed alarms are unacceptable. Barham demonstrates the asymmetry. Acting unnecessarily consumes fuel and tempo. Failing to act consumes the system. The cost curves are incomparable. As this asymmetry is accepted, doctrine shifts toward biasing decisions toward early intervention. Early intervention may later prove unnecessary, but it preserves optionality. Late intervention, even if accurate, does not. Barham's loss is late intervention made irrelevant by timing. The accumulation of these biases produces a system that appears cautious, even timid, when viewed through traditional lenses. However, it is resilient under compression. It trades initiative for control when margins shrink. Initiative can be regained later. Control cannot be regained once lost. This trade-off is visible in how formations maneuver. Rather than pursuing maximal coverage or presence, they preserve spacing and flexibility. Gaps are preferred to clusters. Clusters invite rapid escalation. Barham's formation presents a cluster whose internal spacing allows a single attacker to create simultaneous effects faster than response. From a mathematical perspective, clustering increases the dimensionality of escalation. One breach interacts with multiple subsystems. Separation reduces coupling. Barham's destruction demonstrates the danger of tight coupling under time pressure. Later doctrine treats decoupling as a primary defense. Decoupling is implemented physically through spacing and structurally through command independence. Units are empowered to maneuver independently when margins erode. Centralized control is relaxed to reduce communication latency. Barham operates under centralized assumptions that delay reaction. Those delays are fatal. As decentralization increases, the system sacrifices some coherence but gains time. This is acceptable because coherence without time is meaningless. Barham's coherence does not save it. It accelerates loss by asynchronizing exposure. The same logic extends to logistics and sustainment. Resupply patterns are adjusted to avoid predictable windows where protection lapses. Predictability compresses attacker planning time. Unpredictability stretches it. Barham's routines are predictable. That predictability enables alignment. The enduring lesson is that predictability is a temporal vulnerability. The more predictable a system's behavior, the easier it is to synchronize attack within its response limits. Barham exemplifies this vulnerability. Later systems deliberately introduce variability to complicate timing calculations. As all these adaptations accumulate, the system becomes less dramatic but more survivable. It rarely produces singular moments of destruction or triumph. Instead, it produces extended periods of controlled interaction. This outcome lacks narrative appeal but achieves strategic stability. HMS Barham remains narratively powerful precisely because it belongs to an earlier regime where such stability is absent. Its destruction is sudden, total, and irreversible. That clarity allows later generations to anchor abstract reasoning in concrete consequence. The monolith persists because the constraint it articulates does not relax. Speed continues to increase. Human limits remain fixed. Systems that forget this relationship drift back toward the boundary. When they cross it, history resumes recording rather than responding. Thus, the analysis continues without needing new evidence. Each additional layer of doctrine, design, and behavior reinforces the same requirement. Preserve time, distrust confidence, enforce early action, prevent tight coupling under compression. HMS Barham's final contribution is not a tactical lesson, but a structural warning. It shows what happens when confidence substitutes for margin and when margin erosion goes unmeasured. The result is not defeat in battle, but loss of agency itself. As long as agency depends on time, the condition exposed in 1941 remains operative. It does not age. It does not forgive. It waits at the intersection of speed and assumption, defining the exact point where control ends and consequence begins. The destruction of HMS Barham must be understood not as an isolated wartime catastrophe, but as a boundary event in the evolution of modern warfare. It sits at the intersection where industrial-scale platforms, human decision cycles, and accelerating weapon systems first collide without buffer. Before November 25, 1941, naval warfare still operated on an implicit assumption that even catastrophic damage unfolded slowly enough to permit human intervention. Barham disproved that assumption decisively. In historical scale, this moment belongs to the same lineage as later events where speed nullified control. The first radar-directed interceptions, the first guided missiles, the first automated retaliation doctrines. Barham is earlier, cruder, but structurally identical. It reveals that once execution velocity exceeds the combined limits of detection, cognition, and action, war ceases to be a contest of adaptation and becomes a sequence governed by physics alone. What makes Barham enduring is not the technology involved, steam turbines, cordite, torpedoes, but the inequality it exposes. That inequality has never been resolved. It has only been managed temporarily through margin, layering, and restraint. Every subsequent advance in weapon speed or reach threatens to reopen it. Each generation must therefore re-engineer buffers anew, recalculating margins that cannot be inherited unchanged. In this sense, HMS Barham marks the end of an era in which resilience could be assumed from mass and strength. After Barham, survivability becomes conditional, contingent on time preserved rather than armor endured. The capital ship survives not because it can absorb punishment, but because it can prevent punishment from arriving inside an irreversible window. Strategically, this realization reshapes power projection across the remainder of the war and beyond. Navies disperse, integrate air power, prioritize early warning, and accept limits on presence. These changes are not philosophical. They are enforced by the mathematics of response. Barham demonstrates that when those mathematics are ignored, loss is absolute and immediate. Historically, the ship's sinking fades into the larger narrative of World War II, overshadowed by Pearl Harbor weeks later, subsumed by global escalation. Analytically, however, it remains singular. It is one of the clearest cases where outcome is fixed before intent can matter. That clarity makes it a permanent calibration point. From 1941 onward, modern warfare increasingly becomes an effort to avoid Barham-like moments. Moments when systems cross from controllable to historical time without realizing it. Where that effort succeeds, history appears uneventful. Where it fails, collapse arrives without negotiation. In the long view, HMS Barham does not teach navies how to fight. It teaches them when fighting is already impossible. It defines the thin temporal line beyond which courage, skill, and command no longer operate. That line has not moved. Only the speeds approaching it have increased. As long as war is fought by systems constrained by human limits and governed by accelerating mechanisms, the condition revealed by Barham remains active. It does not belong to the past. It persists quietly in every plan, every formation, every assumption about control. Barham sank in minutes. The lesson it imposed has endured for decades, shaping doctrine not through memory, but through necessity. An enduring reminder that in modern war, the decisive resource is not firepower, but time preserved before it is gone.